Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a podcast exclusively designed to create more reproductive health awareness and discuss your fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I am so delighted to have Dr. Paula Amato on today's show. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
I read your article about donating your embryos, and I said, wow, I have to have you talk about this on the show. So that's what we're going to talk about. And the title of today's show is What Donating My Embryos Taught Me About Being a Fertility Doctor. And for our listeners, I want them to get to know you a little bit better. So I'll share a little bit more about you. You're a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the Oregon Health and Science University School of Medicine in Portland, Oregon. You're also a reproductive endocrinology and infertility specialist with over 33 years experience in the medical field. You graduated from University of Toronto Medical School and did your fellowship at UC San Diego. You've authored numerous articles in fertility and sterility, and today we're going to talk about the most recent article, The Fertile Window, What Donating My Embryos Taught Me About Being a Fertility Doctor. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you.
So I love learning about how people got interested in the field of fertility. What drew you to be an REI doctor?
I think initially I was attracted to being an OBGYN because of the obstetrics piece. But during my OBGYN training, I became very interested in REI. I think I was just fascinated by the science. I was really interested in the endocrinology piece, actually. I found it fascinating. And I just loved the patient. I thought it would be a really rewarding career. And 30 plus years later, I'm happy to say I think we have the best job in the world.
You look like you're 30 years old. You have to tell us your secret later. So you froze embryos in your 30s using sperm from an anonymous sperm donor. What led you to that decision?
I found myself in my 30s single after a brief marriage, and I was working as a fertility specialist. I was junior faculty at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and I always thought that I wanted to have children, but I wanted to have children in the context of a relationship. So as a fertility specialist, I was very well aware of the age-related fertility decline, and of course, I was in a very privileged position because I was working as an infertility specialist. So I thought, I'm just going to take advantage of this option, fertility preservation, just in case, as a backup, my insurance plan, if it didn't work out.
Yeah. And why did you choose embryos versus eggs?
So this was about 15 years ago now. So this was before vitrification. And for your listeners, vitrification is a newer freezing technology, which is a lot more successful than the slow freezing method we had at the time. So freezing eggs wasn't that successful at the time. So that was one reason. The other reason was at the time, and now I'm primarily in a relationship with women. So it wasn't like I was waiting for Mr. Right. I was going to be using donor sperm anyway. So I went ahead and chose a anonymous sperm donor and decided to freeze embryos.
And what made you decide to forego using your own frozen embryos?
So I was never, unfortunately, in a position in a relationship that was stable enough with someone who really wanted children until my late 40s. And then when we were together enough that we started that conversation, we really decided that at that point, we were really too old to parent. And I realize it's a very individual decision, and maybe somebody else might have made a different decision. But my partner is a few years older than I am. We talked about it and we thought, you know what, we're just too old at this point to initiate our family building. And we have a very rewarding life with lots of nieces and nephews. You know, we made that decision together.
And once that decision was made, what made you consider donating your embryos?
As you know, if you have embryos stored, you have a few options in terms of disposition. You could keep them frozen indefinitely, you could discard them, or you could donate them to research, or you could donate them to another patient. So of those options, donating to research, there was nothing special about my embryo, so I didn't think it would add that much to scientific research. And I didn't feel great about discarding them. And I see patients every day who obviously aren't sometimes successful using their own gametes, or sometimes can't access donor gametes because of financial barriers. And I thought this is a good thing to do. And I thought it would be a way to pay it forward, and I thought about it a lot and then decided ultimately that's what I wanted to do.
And you talk about the fertile window. Can you teach us a little bit more about that?
Fertile window has a few different meanings. So we can think of it as that part in the cycle, for example, that's the most fertile around ovulation. But you can also think of it in the course of a woman's lifespan, those years, reproductive years that are the most fertile, usually 20s and 30s. But there's also a parenting window, as I came to realize. There's a window of time in your life when it might be optimal to parent. And again, I know it's a very individual decision, but for me, all those windows started to come into focus a bit.
Yeah. And I imagine the parenting window is a very personal thing
Yeah.
for you to get to. And what led you to dig into your own genetics and the genetics of your embryos?
So when I finally made that decision to donate my embryos, I started looking for a recipient. So there's a few different avenues. You can use a site that I use called Miracles Waiting. There's a company called Embryo Connections. There's a variety of different embryo donation companies. So I started looking into it. I found a recipient, actually the first person I contacted, and we had a few email exchanges. I thought this would be a good fit. But at the time, this again was 15 years ago, was before the time of expanded carrier screening. So I hadn't done any expanded carrier screening at the time, and the donor had really only had maybe cystic fibrosis testing, and that's about it. And he was a Jewish donor, so I know that certain diseases are more prevalent in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And the last thing I wanted was to donate embryos that were affected with some kind of disease. So I first did carrier screening on myself and was surprised to learn that I'm a carrier for this really rare but very serious metabolic disease that causes really serious neurological problems. So I really was motivated to find out that the donor wasn't a carrier of the same mutation, because obviously if we both were carriers, then a potential child would be at risk. So I had to find this anonymous sperm donor. So first I contacted the sperm bank and I said, hey, I used sperm from your bank 15 years ago. Would you mind reaching out to the donor, see if he would agree to testing? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, we'll do that. But I'm not sure that they ever did, never heard back from them. So I doubt that they actually tried very hard. Then I contacted some patients through the donor sibling registry, which you may be familiar with. This is a website that includes people who have used donor sperm or donor eggs or donor embryos to create their families. And it's a way for siblings to kind of match with each other and parents to match with each other. So I found some people on that site that had used the same donor that I had used. And there was about maybe 6 children from that particular donor. So I contacted one of the moms and found out that she knew some of the other patients that had used this particular donor. And as far as she knew, all the children were like happy and healthy. Nobody had any serious diseases. So that was reassuring, but it's still, I wanted the proof. So I had the profile from this donor that I saved from 15 years ago. And there was enough information on there, believe it or not, with the internet, of course, that I was actually able to locate this man that I was like 99.9% sure was the donor. And I found out also that he was married, had his own children. I was able to find an email address for him. And, it was a little bit hesitant to contact him. I didn't want to think I was stalking him or something. I can imagine it'd be very disconcerting to get an email like that. But ultimately I did. And he was very gracious, actually, and I'm very grateful to him. But he said, she told the situation, and he said, yeah, sure, no problem. I'll agree to get tested. I'm like, great. So got him tested, and he's not a carrier for the same thing that I'm a carrier for. He's a carrier for a few other things, but it wasn't an issue because I was negative for those mutations.
Great. And then what did you discover about your 9 embryos?
So I had 9 embryos frozen. 6 were frozen at day 3 stage, which is what we used to do back then, and 3 were blastocysts, so day 5 and 6. And the person I had agreed to donate to had a history. She had undergone multiple cycles of IVF and failed, and then actually had 2 miscarriages of euploid embryos. So she was very interested in having euploid embryos donated to her. And I could totally understand that. I think if I was using my embryos for myself, I probably wouldn't have undergone PGT. I would have probably just transferred them. But given that I was very motivated to donate to this particular recipient and I understood her history, I decided that I'm just going to test these embryos before I donate them to make sure they're chromosomally normal. So they were thawed at the fertility clinic where I work now, and the blastocysts predictably didn't survive very well, but the day 3s did, and we cultured those 2 blastocysts and 2 made it. 2 were biopsied, and they both came back chromosomally abnormal. And that was the end of my embryos.
Wow. And just how did that make you feel?
There was definitely a sense of loss, and I don't want to say that it's like equivalent to what people go through who are undergoing infertility, because I never tried to get pregnant. I never underwent infertility treatment per se, but I learned, especially because I was feeling quite sad at that moment, that I was very attached to these embryos, or the idea of having a biologic child, if not myself, somebody else. And so it was very sad, which is not to say that I had any regrets really, because the decisions were the right decisions for me at the time, but I was sad. And I was also sad about the potential relationship with this recipient who I had grown close to. I thought, this would be a very unique relationship. So I was sad to lose that, but we're still friends. So I'm grateful for that.
And what did you learn about the process of freezing and donating embryos through this?
I learned quite a bit. As a doctor, I think I became quite more empathetic about what my patients go through. I realized that there's a lot of waiting involved. There's this feeling of lack of control because lots of things are out of our control. There's an emotional roller coaster that happens. So I think ultimately it made me a better doctor. And I think it also helped me counsel patients better in terms of options for fertility preservation and embryo donation as a family building option.
And what do you wish that patients knew about this process?
More patients and doctors actually were aware of this option. I think people are, but maybe don't suggest it as often as perhaps we should. There's over something like 1.5 million frozen embryos in the United States. And I understand, again, it's a very personal decision. Not everybody's going to want to donate their embryos. But I think if we introduce the subject, I think earlier in the fertility journey, I think more people would be receptive, both recipients and donors. I think it's a great way to build a family. I know infertility treatment is not always accessible to everyone because it's not always covered by insurance and there's financial barriers. So this is a much more affordable option. And for patients that have surplus embryos, often they're conflicted about what to do with them. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to donate your embryos. It's a way to pay it forward. I wish people just had more awareness about that. Mm-hmm. And then on the fertility preservation side, when I talk to my young patients in their 20s and 30s and some of my medical trainees, and they're in a similar position that I was perhaps in their 30s, where they might be single or still pursuing education and career and not at a place in their life where they can start their family. We counsel them about egg freezing. I know you do a great job about counseling patients out there about that potential option, but I want people to realize that it's not a guarantee. Having said that, there is an even psychological benefit to doing it, even if it doesn't work out in the end. I think you feel like you did something proactive, you thought about it, etc. But it's a great option for someone who's not quite ready to have a child, thinks they want to have a child, but it's not a guarantee. So I just want people to understand that what the options are and what the limitations are. I think when I counsel my patients now, I tell them they absolutely should consider doing pre-implantation genetic testing on their embryos if they're freezing embryos, because you want to know if you're freezing something and you're not planning to use them for many years later, that they were actually normal. Because if not, then of course, you're just going to do another cycle if you can. And that wouldn't apply necessarily to everybody, not people in their 20s, but certainly people like me, mid to late 30s, I think I would definitely recommend it.
And what do you wish doctors knew as they lead patients through this process?
Again, I wish there was more awareness about embryo donation as an option, both for recipients and for donors. And also when counseling patients about fertility preservation, I think we need to be very frank with our patients and tell them, yes, this is an option and there are benefits to doing it, but it's expensive and there's no guarantees. And as long as the patient is counseled and they still decide to pursue it, I think it's definitely something people should avail themselves of. The other thing I learned, I have more sympathy now for donor conceived children who want to know their genetic origins. I kind of know how frustrating it can be to know that some sperm bank out there or some fertility clinic knows the identity of your sperm donor or egg donor or embryo donor, but is not allowed to release it to you or doesn't want to release it to you. So I have much more sympathy for those people and how strong that motivation can be. So I've become kind of a proponent of open donation. I think donors' rights should be respected as well. So I don't think it should be applied retrospectively unless donors agree at a later date to reveal their identifying information. But moving forward, I think we should definitely encourage more open donation.
I agree. And there's such a gender gap between sperm donors and egg donors too. Thank you for sharing your story today. There are so many lessons to be learned. And it's just so wonderful as a fertility doctor that you can share everything so openly with us. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you would like to add today?
I'd like to say that this is my first personal essay. As you mentioned, I've written very many scientific articles, but this is the first time I shared something so personal. And I think when I first wrote this essay, it was for me, it was very therapeutic for myself. But then I realized that sharing stories is actually a wonderful way to help our patients. And I hope that it's helpful to both potential donors and recipients and patients out there. The other thing I think is very important that we as a field and as a society continue our advocacy efforts to try and increase access to infertility insurance coverage at the employer level, at the state level. I think it's just, there's so many disparities amongst who can access infertility treatment that we should do our best to try and reduce those and eliminate those, hopefully. And also, I think it's really important that we advocate for policies that help women have children during their peak reproductive years, because that really is the best time to have children. Again, it's kind of a personal decision, but I think things like paid parental leave and flexible work schedules and subsidized childcare and all those things are very important if, as a society, we think it's important to support women in particular, but also men, to have children during their peak reproductive years and not at the expense of their pursuing their career and education.
I agree with that so much. So where can people find you and your article?
So you can Google my name in the fertile window and it should come up. And I'm hoping it's open access, but if anybody has trouble